The bitter winter wind whistled through the tall buildings of Manhattan, carrying with it the scent of roasted chestnuts and coffee from nearby street vendors. For most people, it was just another Monday morning, but for 16-year-old Lily, it marked day 1,825 of life on the streets, 5 years of surviving on her own. Huddled in her usual spot behind the old bakery, Lily pulled her threadbare jacket tighter around her shoulders. The morning rush had begun, and the back door of the bakery would open soon. Mr. Chen, the kind-hearted owner, always pretended not to notice when she grabbed the day-old bread he'd accidentally left by the dumpster. "You're up early today," came a familiar voice. Lily looked up to see Mrs. Washington, a grandmother figure to many of the street kids, making her way down the alley with her shopping cart filled with recyclables. The elderly woman had been teaching Lily the ins and outs of street survival since she first ran away from her last foster home. "Couldn't sleep," Lily replied, her hand automatically reaching for the silver locket that hung around her neck. It was the only thing she had from her past, a beautiful oval piece with intricate engravings, though its clasp had been broken for years. Her foster mother, the only good one she'd had, gave it to her on her 12th birthday, just months before the accident that turned Lily's world upside down. As the city stirred to life, Lily began her daily routine. She helped Mrs. Washington sort through her recyclables, their fingers numbing in the cold as they separated glass from plastic. "You know," Mrs. Washington said, her wise eyes twinkling, "that fancy new shelter on 23rd Street opened last week. Heard they got hot showers and real beds." Lily shook her head. "You know, I don't do shelters anymore. Not after what happened at the last one. The memory of stolen belongings and broken trust still stung. Besides, she had a system now." Between the bakery, the public library where she spent her afternoons reading everything she could get her hands on, and the late-night cleaning job at a small office building, where the supervisor looked the other way about her age, she was managing. The morning crowd started flooding the sidewalks, a sea of suits and coffee cups rushing past their alley. Lily watched them with curiosity, making up stories about their lives in her head. That was her favorite game, imagining the lives behind the faces. The tall woman in the red coat. She was secretly a superhero. The old man with the briefcase. A retired spy writing his memoirs. Around 9, Mr. Chen appeared with a bag of surplus bread. "Too much baking today," he said loudly, making sure the other workers could hear. "Have to throw these away." He placed the bag carefully beside the dumpster, giving Lily a quick wink before heading back inside. Lily shared the bread with Mrs. Washington, and they sat together, watching the city wake up. A group of pigeons gathered nearby, hoping for crumbs, and Lily tossed them small pieces of bread. "You've got such a big heart, child," Mrs. Washington observed. "Always sharing, always helping. That's rare out here." It was true. Despite her circumstances, Lily had never let the streets harden her heart. She was known among the homeless community for sharing whatever she had, for helping newcomers find safe spots to sleep, and for watching over the younger kids who found themselves alone on the streets. Her small acts of kindness didn't go unnoticed. The hot dog vendor on the corner often accidentally made an extra hot dog at the end of his shift. The librarian would save interesting books she thought Lily might like. And the coffee shop barista sometimes left a cup of hot chocolate by the back door during her break. As the morning wore on, Lily helped an elderly man find his way to the subway station, gave directions to a lost tourist, and shared her bread with a young runaway who reminded her too much of herself. Each interaction, though brief, reminded her that even without a home, she was still part of the city's fabric. Around noon, Lily made her way to her favorite spot in Central Park. There was a quiet corner near the pond where she could sit and watch the world go by. She pulled out a worn paperback, her current treasure from the library, and lost herself in its pages. Reading was her escape, her window to other worlds, and her way of keeping her mind sharp despite being out of school. But even as she read, her hand kept finding its way to the locket around her neck. Sometimes, in moments like these, memories would flash through her mind, fragments of a life she couldn't quite remember. A woman's laugh, the smell of vanilla, a big house with blue shutters. But they were like trying to catch smoke. The harder she tried to hold onto them, the quicker they slipped away. Little did Lily know that her simple routine was about to change forever. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the park, she had no idea that tomorrow would bring an encounter that would unlock the mysteries of her past and completely transform her future. But for now, she was just another face in the crowd, a guardian angel to some, a ghost to others, and a mystery to herself. The morning started like any other, with heavy rain clouds hanging low over the city skyline. Lily had taken shelter under the awning of a closed coffee shop, watching as people hurried past with their umbrellas and raincoats. The weather forecast had predicted the worst storm of the season, and she could feel it in her bones. Today would be different. The first drops fell slowly, then all at once, as if someone had turned on a giant shower over Manhattan. The streets quickly became slick with rain, and the usual morning rush took on a more chaotic energy. Lily pulled her jacket tighter, grateful that she'd managed to patch its biggest holes with some thread she'd found last week. She was about to make her way to the library, her usual refuge on rainy days, when she noticed something wasn't right. The intersection ahead was especially busy, with cars honking more than usual. Through the curtain of rain, she spotted an expensive black car moving too fast for the wet conditions. At the same time, an older man was stepping off the curb, completely absorbed in his phone. Time seemed to slow down. Lily saw it all happening before anyone else did. The car hitting a deep puddle, the wheels losing their grip, the driver's panicked face as the vehicle started to spin. Without thinking, she sprinted forward, her worn sneakers splashing through puddles. The old man hadn't even looked up from his phone yet. "Look out!" she screamed, but her voice was lost in the noise of the storm. Running on pure instinct, Lily launched herself forward, pushing the man back onto the sidewalk with all her might. She felt the rush of air as the car spun past them, missing them by inches before coming to a stop against a lamp post. For a moment, everything was chaos. People were shouting, car horns were blaring, and the rain kept pouring down. Lily found herself sitting on the wet sidewalk, her heart pounding in her chest. The man she'd saved was looking at her with wide, stunned eyes. He was older than she'd first thought, maybe in his 50s, wearing an expensive suit that was now soaked through. You saved my life," he said, his voice shaking slightly. He reached out a hand to help her up, but Lily winced. Her ankle had twisted when she fell. Before she knew it, people were gathering around them. Someone had called an ambulance, though Lily kept insisting she was fine. The man she'd saved wouldn't leave her side, and she noticed his hands were trembling despite his composed face. "I'm Mr. Thompson," he said softly, kneeling beside her despite his expensive suit getting muddy. "Please let me help you. It's the least I can do." Lily's street instincts told her to run. Getting involved with people, especially rich people, usually meant trouble. But her ankle was throbbing, and there was something in Mr. Thompson's eyes, a kind of sadness mixed with wonder, that made her pause. As they waited for the ambulance, he kept looking at her face, as if trying to solve a puzzle. Lily felt uncomfortable under his gaze and unconsciously reached for her locket, a habit she developed whenever she felt nervous. Mr. Thompson's eyes widened as he spotted the silver oval pendant. "That locket," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Where did you get it?" Before Lily could answer, the ambulance arrived, its sirens cutting through the sound of rain. The paramedics insisted on checking her ankle, and in the confusion, she lost sight of Mr. Thompson. But as they helped her into the ambulance, she saw him talking intensely with his driver, occasionally glancing in her direction. At the hospital, the doctors confirmed it was just a mild sprain. They gave her some ice and an ace bandage, but Lily was more concerned about getting out of there. Hospitals meant questions, questions meant social services, and social services meant running again. She'd been through this dance before. But when she finally managed to slip out of the examination room, she found Mr. Thompson waiting in the hallway. He'd changed into dry clothes, but his face still carried that same intense expression. "Please," he said, holding up his hands as she turned to leave. "I know you probably want to go, but I need to ask you something. That locket you're wearing, does it have an engraving on the back? 3 small birds flying over a rising sun." Lily's hand flew to her neck, clutching the locket. How could he know that? She'd never shown anyone the engraving. It was her secret, her only clue to a past she couldn't remember. The rain had stopped outside, but Lily could feel a different kind of storm brewing. The way Mr. Thompson looked at her, the fact he knew about the engraving, the tremble in his voice when he asked. It all meant something. Something big, something that would change everything. Standing in that sterile hospital hallway, with her ankle wrapped and her clothes still damp from the rain, Lily faced a choice. She could run, like she always did, disappear back into the streets where she knew how to survive. Or she could stay, could listen to what this stranger had to say about a locket she'd worn for as long as she could remember. Little did she know, this moment, this simple choice between running and staying, would be the turning point of her entire life. The universe had orchestrated a perfect storm, bringing together a lost daughter and a searching father through an act of selfless courage on a rainy New York morning. Back in his penthouse office, Mr. Thompson couldn't focus on work. His hands trembled as he opened an old leather folder he hadn't touched in 15 years. Inside were newspaper clippings, faded photographs, and countless private investigator reports, all centered around one tragic story that had haunted him for years. He spread the contents across his mahogany desk, his eyes landing on a photograph of a smiling woman holding a toddler. His wife, Rose, and their 2-year-old daughter. The same silver locket that he'd seen around Lily's neck was clearly visible in the photo, hanging from Rose's neck. "Sir," his assistant poked her head in, "your investigator is here." Mr. Chen from the bakery was closing up shop when he noticed an unfamiliar man asking questions in the neighborhood. The man was discreet, showing a photo of Lily to selected people. What caught Mr. Chen's attention was how he specifically asked about her background and how long she'd been on the streets. Meanwhile, Lily had returned to her usual spots, her ankles still tender but healing. The encounter with Mr. Thompson had shaken her more than she wanted to admit. That night, as she sat in her hidden corner behind the public library, she opened the locket for the first time in years. The engraving was there, just as always, 3 birds soaring over a rising sun. But now it felt different, like a message she was finally ready to understand. She closed her eyes, trying to remember anything from before the foster homes. A woman's soft voice singing a lullaby. The smell of fresh-baked cookies. A big house with a garden. "You look troubled, child," Mrs. Washington said, finding Lily in her usual spot the next morning. The elderly woman sat down beside her, her cart of recyclables forgotten for a moment. "Have you ever felt like your whole life might be different from what you thought?" Lily asked, still touching the locket. Mrs. Washington's wise eyes studied her face. "You know, I've watched a lot of lives change on these streets. Sometimes the biggest changes come right when we think we've got it all figured out." Across town, Mr. Thompson sat in a private investigator's office, looking at old case files. 15 years ago, he explained, his voice tight with emotion, "My wife Rose took our daughter and left. We were having problems, fighting about my long work hours, my focus on building the company." The investigator nodded, typing notes. "And then? 6 months later, Rose died in a car accident in Ohio. But our daughter," he paused, composing himself. "They never found her body. The police said she probably wasn't in the car, but by then Rose had changed their names. I've been searching ever since." Back on the streets, Lily helped an elderly woman with her groceries, her mind still spinning with questions. The woman reminded her of her last foster mother, the one who'd given her the locket. "It belonged to your real mother," the foster mother had said. "She left it with you when." But then the accident happened, and Lily never heard the end of that story. In his office, Mr. Thompson reviewed security footage from the accident scene. He watched again and again as Lily pushed him out of the car's path. Something about her movements, her instincts, reminded him so much of Rose. The same selflessness, the same quick thinking in a crisis. That evening, as the city lights began to twinkle on, Lily sat by her favorite window in the public library. She'd always felt safe here, surrounded by books and stories. An old yearbook caught her eye, from the very high school she might have attended if life had been different. As she flipped through its pages, a newspaper clipping fell out. Her heart nearly stopped when she saw the headline, "Local business leader's wife and daughter missing." The article was old, but the photo made her gasp. The woman in the picture wore her locket, the exact same locket that now hung around Lily's neck. Mr. Thompson's investigator worked through the night, piecing together fragments of the past. Hospital records from Ohio showed a young girl admitted on the night of Rose's accident, no parents present. Foster care documents revealed a trail of homes, name changes, and eventually, a girl who vanished from the system at age 12. In her corner of the library, Lily read the article again and again. The woman's name was Rose Thompson. She had left her husband, taking their 2-year-old daughter with her. The article mentioned the distinctive family heirloom she always wore, a silver locket with 3 birds soaring over a rising sun. Somewhere in the city, a social worker was pulling old files, responding to the investigators' queries. The pieces were all there, waiting to be connected. A lost child, a grieving father, a family torn apart by circumstance and misunderstanding. That night, as Lily huddled in her usual sleeping spot, she looked up at the stars barely visible through the city's light pollution. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to wonder about her real family. Were they looking for her? Did they miss her? Could they be closer than she ever imagined? Little did she know, just a few miles away, Mr. Thompson stood at his penthouse window, looking at the same stars. In his hand, he held an old photograph of a silver locket, a family heirloom passed down through generations, last seen around his wife's neck 15 years ago until today. The truth was there, hidden in plain sight, waiting to be discovered. All it needed was time, courage, and perhaps a little help from fate, the same fate that had brought a homeless girl and a businessman together on a rainy Manhattan morning. The city was entering its coldest winter in decades. Lily huddled deeper into her threadbare coat, worried about her friend Tom, the elderly veteran who'd been coughing badly for days. The usual spot behind the bakery didn't offer much protection from the biting wind, and Tom's cough was getting worse by the hour. "You need to see a doctor," Lily insisted, sharing her morning bread with him. Tom just shook his head, stubborn as always. He'd been on the streets longer than Lily had been alive, and distrusted anything that reminded him of institutions. Meanwhile, Mr. Thompson's search was gaining momentum. His private investigator had traced a path through foster homes and school records, each document bringing them closer to understanding Lily's past. But the businessman found himself distracted by a different project, the opening of a new homeless shelter his foundation had funded. "The shelter opens tomorrow," Mr. Thompson told his assistant, looking out at the snow beginning to fall. "Make sure they have enough warm blankets and clothing. And double the food budget. It's going to be a harsh winter." Back on the streets, Tom's condition deteriorated rapidly. His cough turned deeper, and Lily noticed the bluish tinge to his lips. That night, as the temperature dropped below freezing, she made a decision that would change everything. "We're going to the new shelter," she declared, helping Tom to his feet. He tried to protest, but his strength was gone. "I don't care if you hate shelters. I'm not watching you die out here." The new shelter was different from any Lily had seen before. Clean, well-lit, with private spaces for families and individuals. The staff didn't ask too many questions when she brought Tom in, focusing instead on getting him immediate medical attention. "Your friend has pneumonia," a kind-faced nurse told Lily later. "He needs to stay here for treatment. You should stay too. There's a bed available." Lily hesitated, her street instincts fighting with her exhaustion. The shelter felt safe, somehow different from the others she'd avoided. She didn't know it was because Mr. Thompson had specifically designed it to welcome people who usually avoided such places. That same evening, Mr. Thompson sat in his office, reviewing security footage from the shelter's first day. His heart nearly stopped when he saw Lily helping an elderly man through the entrance. She was there, in his shelter, right under his nose. But he couldn't rush in. The private investigator had warned him about approaching too quickly. She survived on her own for years, the investigator had said. Trust has to be earned slowly. So Mr. Thompson did something unexpected. He started volunteering at the shelter, wearing simple clothes, introducing himself only as Richard. He served meals, handed out blankets, and slowly became a familiar face to the residents. Lily stayed at the shelter, partly to be near Tom, and partly because the bitter cold made living on the streets nearly impossible. She noticed the quiet man named Richard who seemed different from other volunteers. There was something familiar about him she couldn't quite place. During the days, she helped in the shelter's kitchen, finding satisfaction in preparing meals for others who were struggling. At night, she read books from the shelter's small library, often touching her locket as she read, a habit she'd never been able to break. Mr. Thompson watched her from a distance, his heart aching. She had Rose's smile, her way of helping others even when she had nothing herself. He noticed how the other shelter residents looked up to her, how she seemed to know exactly what each person needed. One evening, while Lily was reading in the shelter's common room, an elderly woman dropped her bag of belongings. As Lily rushed to help pick things up, her locket slipped out from beneath her shirt, catching the light. The elderly woman gasped. "That's such a beautiful piece," she said, reaching out to touch it. "My mother had one just like it, with 3 birds soaring over the sun." It was a custom design from a jeweler on Fifth Avenue, made for just one family. Lily's hand flew to the locket, her heart pounding. At the same moment, Mr. Thompson, who had been arranging blankets nearby, froze in place. The elderly woman continued, unaware of the impact of her words. "Oh yes, I remember the story. The Thompson family had them made, one for each generation. Such a tragedy what happened to them, the wife and little girl who disappeared." Time seemed to stand still in the shelter's common room. Lily's mind raced, connecting dots she'd never seen before. The newspaper article from the library. The way Mr. Thompson had looked at her locket that rainy day. The familiar feeling she got from Richard the volunteer. Tom, now recovering in his bed nearby, watched the scene unfold with wise eyes. He'd seen enough of life to recognize a moment when everything changes. The snow fell softly outside the shelter windows, as if the world was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Mr. Thompson stood rooted to the spot, blankets still in his arms, watching emotions play across Lily's face. Should he step forward? Should he wait? 15 years of searching had led to this moment, but he was terrified of making the wrong move. The elderly woman looked between them, suddenly sensing the weight of what she'd revealed. The common room had grown quiet, other residents instinctively feeling that they were witnessing something important. As the snow continued to fall outside, 2 lives hung in balance: a father who had never stopped searching, and a daughter who had never stopped wondering. The truth was finally surfacing, like a delicate flower pushing through winter frost, ready to bloom in its own time. The morning after the elderly woman's revelation about the locket, Lily couldn't sleep. She sat in the shelter's quiet common room before dawn, turning the silver pendant over and over in her hands. The 3 birds soaring over the rising sun seemed to hold answers she wasn't sure she was ready to find. Outside, the city was covered in fresh snow, making even the dirtiest streets look clean and new. Mr. Thompson, or Richard, as the shelter residents knew him, had spent a sleepless night too, pacing his penthouse floor, making calls to his investigator. The DNA results from her hospital visit after the accident, the investigator said over the phone. They just came in. There was a pause that seemed to last forever. "It's a match, sir. She's your daughter." In the shelter's kitchen, Lily helped prepare breakfast as usual, but her mind was elsewhere. She kept thinking about the way Richard the volunteer had frozen when the elderly woman mentioned the Thompson family. The familiar feeling she got around him suddenly made sense. She'd been seeing her own features reflected back at her. Tom watched her from his recovery bed, noticing her distraction. "Something on your mind, kid?" he asked as she brought him his morning coffee. When she didn't answer right away, he added, "Sometimes the answers we're most afraid of turn out to be the ones we needed all along." Around midday, a social worker named Mrs. Brown arrived at the shelter. She carried a thick folder and asked to speak with Lily privately. In a small office with winter sunlight streaming through frosted windows, Mrs. Brown began to unfold a story Lily had waited her whole life to hear. "Your mother's name was Rose Thompson," Mrs. Brown began, laying out old photographs. "She left New York with you when you were 2 years old, changing both your names to protect you. She was running from what she thought was a bad situation, but she never stopped loving your father." Lily's hands shook as she looked at the photos. There was her mother, beautiful and young, wearing the same locket that now hung around Lily's neck. In some pictures, she held a toddler, Lily herself, though she had no memory of those days. The night of the accident, Mrs. Brown continued gently, "Your mother had decided to return to New York. She'd realized she'd made a mistake in running away. But the roads were icy." She paused, letting Lily absorb the information. "You weren't in the car. She'd left you with a friend while she went to get supplies for the trip. That's how you ended up in the foster system under a different name." As Mrs. Brown talked, pieces of Lily's past started falling into place. The fragments of memories she'd carried all these years, the smell of vanilla, her mother's favorite perfume, the big house with blue shutters, her childhood home, the lullaby she sometimes heard in her dreams, her mother's voice. "Your father never stopped looking for you," Mrs. Brown said, pulling out more recent documents. "The DNA test from your hospital visit after saving him from the car accident, it confirms everything. Mr. Thompson is your father." Just then, there was a soft knock at the door. Richard, Mr. Thompson, stood there, no longer in his volunteer clothes, but in a simple sweater and pants. His eyes were red, like he'd been crying. "I wanted to tell you so many times," he said softly. "Every day at the shelter, watching you help others, seeing how much you look like your mother. But I was afraid of scaring you away." Lily stood up slowly, her legs feeling weak. This man, this kind volunteer who had been serving meals and handing out blankets, was her father. The businessman she'd saved from the accident, the one who'd been searching for her all these years, had found a way to be close to her without pushing too hard. "The shelter," she said suddenly, realization dawning. "You built it." He nodded. "I started the foundation after losing you and your mother. Every shelter, every program, they were all ways of trying to find you, of helping other families stay together." Mrs. Brown quietly gathered her papers, giving them space. Through the window, snow had started falling again, adding to the hushed feeling in the room. Tom's words from earlier echoed in Lily's mind. Sometimes the answers we're most afraid of turn out to be the ones we needed all along. She took a deep breath and looked at her father, really looked at him for the first time. She saw the years of searching in the lines around his eyes, the love in the way he held himself back, letting her set the pace. She saw pieces of herself in his face, in the way he stood, in the gentle strength he carried. "I have your mother's journals," he said softly, "and albums and videos. Whenever you're ready, there's so much to share." Lily's hand went to her locket, her mother's locket, touching it one more time, but now it felt different. It was no longer just a mystery from her past. It was a key that had finally unlocked the door to her future. Outside the shelter's windows, the city continued its winter dance, unaware that within its walls, a story 15 years in the making was finally finding its resolution. A father and daughter, separated by circumstance but connected by an unbreakable bond, stood on the threshold of a new chapter, ready to begin again. The first week after the revelation passed in a blur of emotions. Lily remained at the shelter, needing the familiar surroundings while her world shifted beneath her feet. Mr. Thompson respected her choice, visiting daily but never pushing, allowing her to process everything at her own pace. One cold morning, as they shared coffee in the shelter's kitchen, Lily finally asked the question that had been burning in her mind. "What was she like?" "My mother." Mr. Thompson's eyes softened as he wrapped his hands around his coffee mug. "She was the kindest person I've ever known. Always helping others, just like you do. She loved photography, took pictures of everything. And she had this laugh that could light up a whole room." He pulled out his phone, showing Lily a photo he'd digitized. In it, a young woman with Lily's smile was dancing in autumn leaves, the silver locket catching the sunlight. "This was taken the day we found out we were having you," he said softly. "She was so happy she made me take pictures for hours." Tom, watching from his usual spot, smiled as he saw Lily lean in closer to look at more photos. "Told you the answers would come," he called out, his voice stronger now that his health was improving. The shelter's other residents gave them space, understanding the magnitude of what was unfolding. But they couldn't help noticing how Lily's father would bring fresh pastries from the bakery for everyone, not just his daughter, or how he took time to listen to each resident's story. One evening, Mr. Thompson brought a box of old home videos to the shelter. The staff set up a small TV in a private room, and Lily watched, transfixed, as her early life played out on screen. There she was, taking her first steps, her mother's voice cheering in the background. Another clip showed her second birthday, gleefully smashing cake with tiny hands. "I remember the cake," Lily whispered, surprising herself. It was chocolate with strawberries. Her father nodded, wiping his eyes. "Your mother insisted on making it herself." The kitchen looked like a disaster zone, but she was so proud. As days passed, more memories began surfacing. The big house with blue shutters appeared in several photos, their family home. The vanilla scent she remembered came from her mother's favorite candles. The lullaby that sometimes haunted her dreams was one her mother had composed just for her. But it wasn't all easy. One afternoon, while looking through old papers, Lily found letters her mother had written but never sent. They revealed her struggles, her fears, and ultimately, her regret about leaving. "I thought I was protecting you," Mr. Thompson explained, his voice heavy with old pain. "Working long hours, building the company, I wanted to give you both everything. But I didn't see how lonely your mother was becoming." Lily read the last letter, dated just days before the accident. In it, her mother wrote about coming home, about wanting to make things right. "She believed in second chances," Lily said quietly. Mr. Thompson looked at his daughter, seeing so much of Rose in her face. "She would be so proud of who you've become. Despite everything life threw at you, you kept her kindness, her spirit of helping others." The shelter's director had been observing their reunion with quiet wisdom. One day, she pulled Lily aside. "You know, your father didn't just fund this place. He designed it based on feedback from actual homeless people. He wanted to understand their needs, their fears. He was looking for you in every face." This revelation touched Lily deeply. While she processed her emotions, she continued her regular routine at the shelter, helping in the kitchen, reading to elderly residents, teaching younger ones to read. But now she did it with a new understanding of where her instinct to help others came from. One evening, as snow fell softly outside, Lily found her father sitting alone in the common room, looking at the shelter's bulletin board full of success stories, people who had found homes, jobs, and hope. "I want to help," she said, sitting beside him. "Not just here, but with all the shelters. These people, they're my family too. I can't just walk away from them." Mr. Thompson's eyes filled with tears of pride. "I wouldn't expect anything less from Rose's daughter." He paused, then added, "Our daughter." Together, they began planning ways to improve the shelter system, combining his resources with her first-hand experience. Lily insisted on keeping her volunteer work, even as she slowly began to explore the idea of moving into her father's home. Tom watched it all unfold from his recovery bed, now serving as an unofficial grandfather figure to shelter residents. "See how life works," he would say to newcomers. "Sometimes you have to lose everything to find what you never knew you had." The truth had emerged not just about Lily's identity, but about the power of love to bridge any gap, heal any wound, and find its way home through the darkest of nights. In the shelter that winter, among people who had lost everything, a father and daughter found something precious, each other, and a shared purpose that would change not just their lives, but the lives of countless others. As evening settled over the city, Lily stood at the shelter's window, her father beside her. She touched the locket, no longer a mystery, but a bridge between past and future. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the city in a blank white page, ready for their new story to begin. Spring had arrived in the city, bringing with it new beginnings. The shelter's garden, a project Lily had started with her father's support, was showing its first green shoots. Tom sat in his wheelchair nearby, supervising a group of younger residents as they learned to plant vegetables. "You're going to ace that test tomorrow," Tom called out to Lily, who was studying at a picnic table. After months of hard work with tutors, she was finally taking her high school equivalency exam. Her father had offered to pull strings to get her admitted directly to school, but she had insisted on doing it the right way. Inside her father's penthouse, a room waited for her, painted in soft blues and greens, just as she'd chosen. But Lily wasn't ready to leave the shelter completely. Instead, she split her time between both worlds, building bridges between them. "We need more programs for teenagers," she explained during a foundation board meeting, her voice confident despite her nervousness. "Kids who age out of foster care often end up on the streets because they have nowhere else to go." Her father beamed with pride as board members took notes. In the 6 months since their reunion, Lily had thrown herself into learning about the Foundation's work, bringing fresh perspectives from her own experiences. The next day, Lily stood in front of the bathroom mirror at the shelter, adjusting her graduation cap. The ceremony wasn't the traditional kind. It was a small affair arranged for shelter residents who had completed their GED programs. But to her, it meant everything. "Your mother wore these at her graduation," her father said softly, holding out a pair of pearl earrings. Lily touched them gently, then hugged him, no longer afraid to show affection. The walls between them had fallen slowly, naturally, like winter ice melting in spring sunshine. The graduation ceremony was held in the shelter's common room, transformed by volunteers into a celebration space. Residents who had become like family filled the chairs. Mr. Chen from the bakery provided a towering cake. Mrs. Washington, who had first shown Lily how to survive on the streets, sat in the front row, tears in her eyes. When I first met this young lady, Tom began his speech, his voice strong despite his ongoing recovery. She was sharing her last piece of bread with a stranger. Today, she's showing us all that no matter where you start, it's never too late to begin again. As Lily accepted her diploma, she felt the weight of her mother's locket against her chest. It was no longer just a piece of jewelry or a link to the past. It had become a symbol of how life could come full circle, how lost things could be found, how broken things could be mended. That evening, during the celebration, Lily's father unveiled a surprise. The foundation was launching a new program named after her mother. The Rose Thompson Youth Initiative would provide education, housing, and support for young people aging out of foster care. But that's not all, he announced, looking at his daughter. Lily will be co-directing the program, bringing her unique perspective and incredible heart to help others like herself. The news was met with cheers and applause, but Lily's mind was already racing with ideas. She wanted to create the kind of support system she wished she'd had, one that understood both the practical and emotional needs of young people facing life on their own. Later that night, as the celebration wound down, Lily found herself back in the garden. The city lights twinkled above, competing with the first stars of evening. Tom wheeled himself over, followed by her father. "So," Tom said with a knowing smile, ready for the next chapter. Lily looked between these two men who had become such important parts of her story, one who had helped her survive on the streets, and one who had never stopped searching for her. She thought about all the other stories waiting to be changed, all the other lives waiting to be touched. "You know what's funny?" she said, touching her locket. "All those years on the streets, I was looking for a place to belong. Turns out, helping others find their place is where I belonged all along." Her father wrapped an arm around her shoulders, and Tom reached for her hand. The three of them sat in comfortable silence, watching the garden they'd planted together. New shoots pushed through soil, reaching for the sky, just as new dreams were taking root in Lily's heart. The shelter that had been her refuge was becoming a launching pad for change. The father she found was becoming a partner in creating that change. And the story that had begun with a lost little girl was transforming into something bigger than herself. In the coming months, Lily would split her time between college classes and program development. She would keep her room at the shelter even after moving in with her father, understanding that some bridges shouldn't be burned but strengthened. She would help create a network of support for young people like herself, turning her past struggles into future solutions. As the stars brightened overhead, Lily realized that coming home wasn't just about finding her father or learning her history. It was about finding her purpose, her place in the world, and her power to make that world a little better for others. The garden would grow, the program would flourish, and more stories would be changed. But for now, in this moment, surrounded by love and purpose, Lily was exactly where she needed to be, home at last, in all the ways that mattered.